The morning fog hung low over the Ardennes forest like dirty gauze, muffling sound and turning the world into gradations of gray. Sergeant Marcus Webb sat in the commander's hatch of his M4A3 Sherman, watching his breath crystallize in the December air. His fingers, wrapped in torn wool gloves with the tips cut away, rested on the rim of the hatch. Below him, cramped in the steel belly of the tank, his crew waited in silence, broken only by the occasional static burst from the radio and the metallic tick of cooling engine parts. They had named the tank Last Resort 3 weeks earlier, scratching the letters into the turret with a bayonet tip after dark, when the white officers weren't watching. The name had been Thomas's idea, their loader, who said it with a bitter laugh that made it sound like both a joke and a prophecy. Webb hadn't objected. By December of 1944, serving in the 761st Tank Battalion, the name felt appropriate for more reasons than one. The Sherman they'd been assigned was old, even by the standards of tanks that were already considered death traps. It bore the scars of at least 2 previous crews, patched holes in the hull where German rounds had punched through and been welded over with whatever steel the repair depot could scavenge. The auxiliary fuel tanks that other crews had wisely removed still clung to the rear of the hull, waiting to turn a penetrating shot into an instant funeral pyre. The original 75mm gun had been replaced after the barrel had cracked during the fighting in France, and the replacement didn't quite line up true. Gunner Eddie Rawlings had to compensate 3 degrees left on every shot, a calculation that had to be made in the fraction of a second between acquiring a target and dying. Webb had submitted 3 separate requests for a newer tank. Each one filed properly through channels, each one ignored or denied with bureaucratic efficiency. The white captain who commanded the company had looked at him during the last request with an expression that Webb had learned to read long before he'd ever put on a uniform. It was the look that said, "You should be grateful you're here at all." The 761st had earned the nickname Black Panthers from their determination and ferocity. But to many of the white units they supported, they were still an experiment, a reluctant concession to wartime necessity. They were given the worst equipment, the most exhausted vehicles, the tanks that white crews had already bled in and abandoned. Last Resort carried the mechanical and moral weight of every compromise and insult the Army could heap on men it needed but didn't want. Webb had grown up in Memphis, the son of a man who'd worked the cotton compress for 30 years and died at 52 with lungs full of fiber and a back bent like a question mark. He'd learned early that survival meant being twice as good to be considered half as equal, and he'd carried that lesson through training at Fort Hood, across the Atlantic, through the hedgerows of Normandy, and into the frozen hell of Belgium. At 24, he was the oldest member of his crew and the only one who'd made it through with the same 4 men he'd started with. That was rare enough to be remarkable, and rare enough that other tankers looked at him with a mixture of respect and superstition. The radio crackled to life with the voice of Lieutenant Morrison, a white officer from Kentucky whose discomfort with commanding black soldiers manifested in clipped-in personal orders delivered as if speaking to machinery rather than men. "All Cobra units, this is Cobra 6. Enemy armor reported moving through grid 7-7-9-4-2-3. Heavy concentration. Proceed to blocking position along the creek line. Acknowledge." Webb pressed the transmit switch. "Cobra 6, this is Cobra 2-3. Acknowledged." Moving to position. Single quotes below him, he heard Private James Crawford, their driver, muttered something that was lost in the roar as the Ford GAA engine coughed to life. The whole tank shuddered, then settled into the grinding idle that would be their soundtrack for however long they survived. Rawlings, hunched over his gun sight, crossed himself quickly, his dark fingers tracing the gesture he'd learned from his grandmother in New Orleans. Thomas, arranging the 75mm shells in their ready rack, started humming something low and rhythmic, a field song that had probably existed before there were tanks, before there was an army, before any of this. The assistant driver and bow gunner, Willie Mason, youngest of them at 19, checked his .30 caliber machine gun for the 4th time in as many minutes. Webb could see the boy's hands shaking slightly, not from cold, but from the same terror that lived in all their guts. The knowledge that each time they rolled forward might be the time their luck ran out. Sherman crews across Europe had learned to dread facing German armor. The Panther and Tiger tanks outgunned and outmoored them so thoroughly that engaging them head-on was considered suicide. A Puritan tactical doctrine had evolved accordingly. Attack in numbers. Hit from the flanks, use speed and maneuverability, hope the law of averages worked in your favor. Pray that you were one of the 4 Shermans it took to kill a Panzer, not one of the 3 that died in the attempt. Last Resort lurched forward, tracks chewing frozen earth, and fell into position behind 2 other Shermans from their platoon. They were forming a defensive line along a creek that ran between low ridges. a position that would give them some hull-down advantage if the Germans came from the expected direction. If Webb had learned that battle rarely respected expectations. The fog was lifting now, revealing the landscape in pieces like a photograph developing in solution. Skeletal trees stood in clusters, their bare branches offering concealment that wouldn't stop a rifle round, much less a tank shell. The creek itself was half frozen, a ribbon of black water winding between banks of snow and ice. Beyond it, the ground rose gently toward a tree line about 800 yards distant. Good killing ground if the Germans came through. Also good killing ground if they came from somewhere else and caught the American tanks from the side or rear. Webb scanned the terrain through his binoculars, looking for movement, for the telltale signs of armor. Dust in winter meant tracks churning frozen ground. The geometric lines of vehicles among organic shapes, the flash of glass or metal catching weak sunlight. He saw nothing yet, but he could feel something, a tension in the air like the moment before lightning strikes. Every soldier developed this sense or didn't survive long enough for it to matter. The Germans were coming. The only questions were when and how many. "Loader, go to armor piercing," Webb ordered. "Mason, watch our right flank. Crawford, keep the engine running but stay off the radio frequency. I don't want us broadcasting position." The crew moved with practiced efficiency, each man performing his task without question. They'd been together long enough that words were often unnecessary. They'd learned to anticipate each other, to read the subtle shifts in posture and breathing that signaled fear or readiness or the strange calm that sometimes descended in combat. They were bound together not just by military necessity but by the knowledge that almost no one else cared whether they lived or died. The white units they supported appreciated their tank support when it worked and blamed them when it didn't. The white officers who commanded them saw them as a burden and an obligation. The enemy wanted them dead. Only each other did they have, and the thin steel shell of a tank the army had already written off. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. The cold seeped through every layer of clothing, through the steel hull into bone. Webb's feet had gone numb in his boots. He knew better than to try warming them. That only made the return of sensation more painful. He kept his eyes moving, scanning, checking the radio frequency, watching his crew, monitoring the other tanks in their platoon. Waiting was its own kind of combat, a war of nerves where imagination became the enemy. The first German tank appeared at 42 minutes past 7 in the morning, emerging from the tree line like a predator materializing from shadow. Webb saw it through his binoculars and felt his stomach drop. Panther, a USF. G. Even at 800 yards, he could make out the distinctive sloped glacis plate, the long 75mm gun that made the Sherman's gun look like a toy. Behind it, 3 more Panthers nosed out of the trees, moving in tactical formation, and behind them, dimly visible in the remaining fog, the massive angular shapes of Tiger tanks. "Contact front," Webb said into the intercom, keeping his voice level. "Panther tanks, 800 yards. Multiple targets." The radio came alive with similar reports from other positions. The German attack was developing across the entire defensive line, a heavy push with armor leading. This wasn't a probe or a raid. This was a deliberate assault with the kind of armored force that could break through and exploit deep into Allied rear areas. "All Cobra units engage at will," came Lieutenant Morrison's voice, tight with stress. "Do not, repeat, do not withdraw without orders." Webb heard the first American gunfire, saw the tracer arc out toward the advancing Panthers. Quote, "The shot fell short, kicking up frozen earth 20 yards in front of the lead German tank." And the Panther didn't even slow. At this range, the Sherman's 75mm gun had almost no chance of penetrating the Panther's frontal armor. They would have to wait, hold position as the Germans closed, hope for a flanking shot or a moment of enemy carelessness. The Panthers returned fire. The sound of their guns was different from the Sherman's, a deeper crack that carried authority and threat. Webb watched the first German round streak toward their position. Watched it impact the Sherman to his left with a sound like a giant hammer striking an anvil. The entire tank shuddered, slewed sideways, and stopped. No fire, not yet, but the crew didn't bail out, which meant they were dead or dying inside. "Hold position," Webb said, though every instinct screamed to move, to get out of this death trap, to run. But running meant exposing their thinner side armor, meant breaking formation, meant failing the mission and confirming every racist assumption about black soldiers. They would hold. Another Panther round struck nearby, close enough that Last Resort rocked from the impact against frozen ground. Crawford whimpered slightly, then choked it back. Mason's breathing came fast and shallow over the intercom. Thomas kept humming that same field song, and somehow that was more steadying than any speech Webb could have given. The Panthers were at 600 yards now, still coming, firing methodically. Another American Sherman brewed up, orange flames mushrooming from its hatches as ammunition cooked off. Webb could hear screaming on the radio, cut short. The German tanks were pushing through their defensive line like it wasn't there, and doctrine said the Sherman should be firing, should be trying to slow them down. But Webb knew that firing now meant revealing their exact position and drawing concentrated fire they couldn't survive. He made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff. Crawford, when I give the word, reverse hard. Get us behind that ridgeline to our 6 o'clock. Rawlings, the second we're in position, I want one shot at the trailing Panther's lower hull. Then we move again. Thomas, have the next round ready to load before the first one hits. We're going to move, shoot, and move again. We're not going to fight the way they expect, Sarge, Rawlings said, his voice thick with fear and doubt. That means exposing ourselves alone. The lieutenant said, hold position. The lieutenant's position just got 3 tanks killed and accomplished nothing, Webb said. We do this my way or we die here. Choose now, dots, single quotes. There was a half-second of silence, then Rawlings said, your way. Sarge. Crawford, back us up now. The Sherman lurched backward, engine roaring, tracks spitting frozen earth. They crested the small ridge and dropped down the reverse slope just as a Panther round passed. Through the space they'd occupied, close enough that Webb felt the air displacement. The German tanks had been targeting where last resort had been, not where it was going. First small victory. Crawford spun the tank, presenting the frontal armor toward the enemy again, but from a different position, hull down behind the ridge with only the turret exposed. Webb saw the trailing Panther slightly separated from the others. Its attention focused on the American position it had just destroyed. The tank's lower hull, where armor was thinner to allow for suspension movement, was briefly exposed as it traversed rough ground. Target, Panther tank, 450 yards, armor-piercing, fire when ready, Webb said. Rawlings breathed out, compensated for the gun's alignment issue, squeezed the trigger. The Sherman rocked back, the gun blast deafening even through their padded helmets. Webb watched the tracer, watched the shell streak toward the Panther, watched it strike low and left on the hull. For a moment nothing happened. Then smoke began pouring from the German tank's engine deck. The Panther slowed, stopped, its turret traversing wildly, looking for what had hit it. But last resort was already moving, Crawford driving them along the reverse slope to a new position before the other Panthers could locate them. One hit, Thomas called out. 22 to go. It was a joke, had to be a joke, but Webb felt something shift in the tank. They'd done what Sherman crews weren't supposed to be able to do. They'd engaged a Panther at medium range and scored a disabling hit without dying. The impossibility of doing it 22 more times didn't matter. They'd done it once. Webb navigated by instinct and terrain knowledge, using every dip and fold in the ground, staying off the radio except for brief position updates that he changed as soon as he gave them. The German advance had pushed past the original American defensive line, which meant the Panthers and Tigers were now in the midst of what had been friendly territory, and last resort was behind them, to their flank. Able to engage without immediately being swarmed, they found their second target 15 minutes later, a Panther that had stopped to fire at American infantry holding a stone farmhouse. The German tank commander had his head out of the hatch, directing fire, not expecting threat from his rear. Webb positioned last resort in a small grove of trees, hull down behind a fallen stone wall. Gunner, target Panther tank, 300 yards, rear aspect, fire at will. Rawlings didn't need to be told twice. At this range, against the Panther's thinner rear armor, they had a real chance. The gun fired, the shell struck just below the turret ring, and the Panther seemed to shudder. Its engine kept running, but the turret stopped moving. Crew kill, probably, or damage to the turret traverse mechanism. Either way, it was mission killed out of the fight. They moved again before the other German tanks could respond. Crawford pushing last resort through a drainage ditch that shouldn't have been navigable but was just barely. Webb felt the tracks scrambling for purchase, felt the tank teeter on the edge of throwing a track. Then they were through and racing along a hedgerow that provided concealment from anything more than 100 yards away. The third and fourth kills came within 5 minutes of each other, both Tigers that had gotten separated from their supporting infantry during the confused advance. Webb used the same tactic. Position, one shot, immediate displacement. The Tiger's heavy armor meant he had to get closer, had to risk more, had to aim for specific weak points. Rawlings placed one shell through the vision port of a Tiger, the only vulnerable point on the massive tank's frontal armor at that angle. The second Tiger took 3 shots, the first 2 ricocheting off its glacis plate before the third struck the turret ring and jammed the turret. The German crew bailed out and last resort was gone before they hit the ground. Word began to spread across the radio net. An American tank, identity unknown, was tearing through the German flank. At first, the reports were dismissed, assumed to be confusion or wishful thinking. But as more German tanks stopped advancing, as more armor showed up disabled or burning with no clear indication of what had killed them, the chatter increased. Some units thought it was an American tank destroyer unit that had infiltrated behind enemy lines. Others speculated about a captured German tank being used by American crews. Nobody suggested it might be a single Sherman from a black tank battalion because that didn't fit anyone's assumptions about what was possible. Webb kept moving, kept hunting. He'd stopped thinking about the cold, stopped thinking about fear, stopped thinking about anything except the next target, the next shot, the next position. His crew had fallen into a rhythm that transcended training, pure synchronization born of survival necessity. Crawford anticipated terrain without being told. Rawlings acquired targets with mechanical precision. Thomas loaded with speed that seemed to violate physics. Mason watched flanks and called out threats before they materialized. Kills 5 through 9 happened in a running gun battle along a supply road where German armor had bunched up behind a destroyed bridge. Webb approached from an unexpected angle from the German rear and caught them stationary, presenting perfect target profiles. 5 shots, 4 kills, 1 mobility kill that left a Panther bleeding oil and unable to withdraw. They took return fire that rattled off Last Resort's frontal armor. 1 round missing Crawford's head by what couldn't have been more than 3 inches, punching through the bow plate and exiting through the roof without hitting anyone. Impossible luck, the kind that couldn't last, that maybe they were already borrowing from the future. The German command began to realize something was systematically destroying their armor. Webb heard it on the radio, intercepted communications between German units increasingly frantic, demanding to know what was attacking them, calling for air support that wasn't available in the low clouds, requesting permission to withdraw that wasn't granted. The German commander believed he was facing a coordinated American counterattack and was determined to push through it. He didn't understand he was being hunted by a single broken-down Sherman that should have been scraped for parts weeks ago. Kill number 10 was a Panther that Webb stalked for nearly 40 minutes, following its track marks through a forest, waiting for the perfect moment. When it came, emerging from the trees into a clearing to check its map coordinates. Last Resort was positioned in the tree line 80 yards away. The shot took the Panther in the side, penetrating the ammunition storage. The explosion was immediate and catastrophic, the turret lifting off the hull and tumbling end over end before crashing down 30 feet away. No one survived. 11 and 12 were Tigers supporting a German infantry assault on an American position. Webb came at them from an oblique angle while they were focused forward, placed shots into their side armor that penetrated engine compartments. Both tanks caught fire, both crews bailed, and Last Resort was gone before the smoke cleared. 13 was another Panther, this one commanded by someone smart enough to recognize the pattern of attacks and try to set a trap. They'd left the tank in the open, apparently disabled. Crew visible outside making repairs, waiting for the ghost tank to approach. Webb spotted the other 2 Panthers hidden in the woodline, waiting to catch him in a crossfire. Instead, he circled wide, came up behind the hidden Panthers, and killed both before they knew he was there. The bait tank's crew abandoned their vehicle and ran. By 14, word had reached the American command structure that something extraordinary was happening on their left flank. The German advance had stalled not because of the defensive line that had been broken, but because armor units were reporting losses they couldn't explain and threats they couldn't locate. Requests came through for the mystery tank to identify itself, to coordinate with the main American counterattack being organized. Webb ignored them. The moment he revealed Last Resort's identity, someone would order them back to proper lines, back to proper tactics, back to the role black tankers were supposed to play. He kept moving, kept fighting, kept proving something he couldn't articulate but needed to demonstrate. 15 and 16 died in an ambush Webb set up on a crossroads. He'd found a building with thick stone walls that would stop anything smaller than a tank round, positioned Last Resort inside it, with only the gun barrel protruding from a window. 2 Panthers rolled through the intersection and took shots at point-blank range. Both penetrated, both killed. Crawford drove them through the rear wall of the building before the Germans could respond. Last Resort emerging in a shower of stone and dust. 17 was a Tiger that had stopped to receive orders from a command half-track. Webb's shot killed the Tiger's commander, who'd been standing in the turret hatch talking to an officer in the half-track. The same shot continued through and struck the half-track's radio equipment. The Tiger, effectively blinded and unable to communicate, withdrew from the battle with its crew in near panic. 18 and 19 were Panthers that had circled back to search for the American tank that was destroying their formation. Webb let them pass his position, then shot both in the rear as they moved away. The first went up immediately. The second's crew managed to bail out before their ammunition cooked off, running across frozen ground while their tank burned behind them. 20 was another Tiger, and this one nearly killed them. Webb had gotten aggressive, confident, had positioned last resort poorly, too exposed. And the Tiger spotted them at the same moment Rawlings fired. Both shots struck home. The Sherman's shell penetrated the Tiger's lower glacis plate, probably killing the driver and bow gunner. The Tiger's return shot struck Last Resort's turret, but at an angle, and instead of penetrating it, skipped off the armor, ripping away the commander's cupola, and taking the radio antenna with it. Webb felt the impact like being hit by a train, was thrown against the turret wall hard enough to see stars. His ears rang so badly he couldn't hear anything for a full minute. When his hearing returned, he heard Thomas praying, heard Mason crying, heard Crawford saying his name over and over, asking if he was alive. He was alive. Bleeding from his nose and from a gash above his right eye, probably concussed, but alive. The tank was still running. They could still fight. Status, Webb croaked. Radio's dead, Mason reported. Cupola's gone. Turret traverse is damaged but working. Gun's still good. They couldn't communicate with friendly forces anymore, which meant they were completely on their own. It also meant no one could order them to stop. Webb smiled, tasted blood, kept moving. 21 was a Panther that had run out of ammunition and was withdrawing. Webb shot it anyway in the engine. It wasn't glorious, but it was effective. 22 was a Tiger providing covering fire for German infantry retreat. Webb maneuvered Last Resort between the Tiger and its supporting elements, isolated it, put 2 rounds into its tracks until it couldn't move, then left it there, a fortress that couldn't relocate, effectively removed from the battle. 23 took 3 hours to find. By late afternoon, the German attack had collapsed. What armor remained was pulling back in disorder, trying to escape the killing ground they'd advanced into so confidently that morning. Webb tracked the withdrawal, following tank tracks, listening to engine sounds, hunting for one more. One more to prove it was real, to prove it mattered, to prove that Last Resort was more than a suicide machine, that its crew was more than expendable. He found the last Panther dug in on the edge of a village, protecting the German withdrawal. It was well positioned, hull down, with clear fields of fire in 3 directions. Approaching it conventionally would be suicide, which was probably why it had been left behind to sell itself expensively and buy time. Webb studied the position for 20 minutes while his crew waited in silence. They were exhausted, past fear, past everything except the need to finish. His head throbbed from the concussion. Rawlings's hands shook on the gun controls. Thomas had gone quiet, his humming stopped. Mason had blood on his face from a nosebleed caused by the concussion blast. Crawford's eyes were hollow, staring at nothing. One more, Webb said. Then we're done. Crawford, can you get us around to that hill west of the village? Yes, Sergeant. Do it. The approach took 45 minutes. Using terrain they'd already covered, backtracking, circling wide. By the time they reached the hill overlooking the village, the light was fading, the winter sun dropping toward a horizon obscured by smoke and cloud. The Panther was still in position, unaware that anything had flanked it. Gunner, target Panther tank, 200 yards, side aspect. Identified. Fire when ready. The last shot of the day struck the Panther's side armor at an angle that shouldn't have penetrated but did. Combination of range, ammunition, and luck that turned geometry into mortality. The German tank shuddered, smoke billowing from every hatch, and went still. 23. Webb sat back in his commander's position, which wasn't really a position anymore since the cupola was gone, and felt the exhaustion hit him like physical weight. They'd done something that shouldn't have been possible. A single Sherman, an old one, a damaged one, crewed by men the army didn't want and given equipment it didn't maintain, had destroyed nearly 24 of Germany's best tanks in a single day. Crawford, take us back to American lines, Webb said. Follow the creek bed west, stay off the roads. They drove in silence as darkness fell, navigating by moonlight and memory. The radio was dead, so they couldn't call ahead, which meant when they approached the American positions they nearly got shot by nervous infantry, who saw a tank approaching and assumed it was German. Webb had to stand in the destroyed cupola, exposed, waving a flashlight until someone recognized them. The battalion commander, a white Colonel Webb had never spoken to directly, arrived an hour later. He walked around Last Resort, examining the damage, counting the patched holes, looking at the crew like they were artifacts from another world. Other officers and soldiers gathered, staring, whispering. Sergeant Webb, the colonel said finally, you're telling me this tank accounted for 23 enemy vehicles today? Yes, sir. Witnessed by my crew and verifiable by wreckage locations if you want to send out patrols. The colonel looked at him for a long moment, then at the other officers around them. White men who'd spent the entire war convinced that black soldiers couldn't fight effectively, couldn't be trusted with real responsibility, needed white officers to think for them. How? The colonel asked. Webb thought about explaining tactics, terrain, maneuver warfare, fire discipline, crew coordination. He thought about explaining what it meant to have nothing to lose, to fight because survival wasn't enough, because they needed to prove something that shouldn't have needed proving. He thought about explaining rage and determination, and the strange mathematics were being underestimated became an advantage. Instead, he said, "We didn't stay where you expected us to, sir." That's how. The colonel nodded slowly. Casualties? None, sir. Impossible. Apparently not, sir. There was a long silence. Then the colonel said, "This engagement will be included in our after-action report. Your crew will be recommended for commendations." He paused, then added almost reluctantly, "Well done, Sergeant, the recognition." When it came, was buried in reports that few people outside the battalion would ever read. The story of Last Resort and its crew didn't make the newspapers, didn't become one of the celebrated tank battles of the war, didn't earn the congressional medals that similar actions by white crews might have. The official record listed the day's action as a successful defense by the 761st Tank Battalion, supporting elements of the main American line. If Marcus Webb's name appeared in that record at all, it was in a footnote. They gave Last Resort to a new crew 3 days later. The battalion needed every tank it could field, and Webb's crew was transferred to a replacement Sherman that was newer but felt wrong, like wearing someone else's uniform. Webb heard later that Last Resort was knocked out in the first engagement with the new crew, hit by a Panther at long range, the kind of shot that should have killed Webb a dozen times during his impossible day, but somehow never did. Thomas said it was because the tank knew who was supposed to be in it. Mason said it was just luck, and their luck had run out when they weren't there to use it. Rawlings didn't say anything, just crossed himself again and loaded the gun in their new tank with the same mechanical precision. Webb thought about the 23 German tanks scattered across frozen Belgian countryside, the crews who'd died not understanding what killed them, the commanders who'd lost battles to an enemy that doctrine said couldn't exist. He thought about proving something in the exhausting mathematics of needing to be exceptional just to be treated as adequate. He thought about a suicide machine that turned out not to be, crewed by men who were supposed to be expendable but weren't. The war went on. They fought through the Bulge, across the Rhine, into Germany itself. Webb survived to see victory, survived to go home, survived to discover that the country he'd risked his life to defend still didn't want him eating at its lunch counters or using its bathrooms or living in its neighborhoods. The uniform that had made him a target in Europe made him a target at home, just in different ways. He never spoke about that day in the Ardennes, not to reporters who wouldn't have believed it, not to historians who wouldn't have included it, not to his children who grew up in a world that preferred its war heroes white and its history sanitized. The medals he'd been promised never materialized, lost in bureaucracy and institutional racism. The official records were incomplete, contradictory, eventually forgotten. But on December 18, 1944, in the cold forests of Belgium, a black sergeant in a broken Sherman tank did something that military doctrine said was impossible, that prejudice said was unthinkable, that history has largely chosen to forget. He proved that courage doesn't require recognition to be real, that skill doesn't need validation to be effective, that exceptional performance by people society considers expendable will still be dismissed as impossible even when the evidence is burning on the battlefield. Last Resort sat in a salvage yard for 3 months after it was knocked out, then was melted down for scrap. The metal went into new tanks, new weapons, new machinery. Nothing was wasted in war except sometimes the men who fought it, and always the stories that didn't fit the narrative people wanted to tell. Marcus Webb died in 1987 in Memphis, a few miles from where he'd been born. His obituary mentioned he was a veteran, that he'd served in Europe, that he was survived by 3 children and 7 grandchildren. It didn't mention Last Resort or the 23 tanks, or the day he'd done the impossible in a machine everyone called a death trap. The truth of what happened remains in the frozen earth of Belgium, in the rusted hulks of panzers that still occasionally surface when farmers plow their fields, in the scattered records of a war that was documented obsessively but incompletely. It remains in the stories that veterans told each other in bars and VFW halls, the accounts that were written off as exaggeration or confusion, the achievements that were too extraordinary to be believed when accomplished by men who weren't supposed to be capable of extraordinary things. History is written by the victors, but it's edited by those who decide which victories count and which heroes matter. Marcus Webb's story fell through those cracks, into the space reserved for things that happened but aren't remembered, for truths that challenge comfortable lies, for excellence that makes inequality impossible to justify. But the truth doesn't require belief to be real. 23 German tanks stopped advancing on December 18, 1944. And the reason why is written in after-action reports if anyone cares to look, buried in footnotes if anyone cares to read, preserved in the memories of men who saw what one determined crew could accomplish when fighting was the only option left. They called it a suicide machine until it became something else. A weapon wielded by men who understood that sometimes survival requires proving you deserve it, that sometimes excellence is the only form of resistance available, that sometimes you have to do the impossible just to be recognized as human. Last Resort earned its name in ways its crew never intended, becoming exactly what it said it was, the final option. The last chance, the ultimate response to those who said black tankers couldn't fight, couldn't lead, couldn't accomplish what white soldiers could. It proved them wrong 23 times in one day, and that should have been enough. That it wasn't says more about those who kept score than about those who fought.